The nagging voice of conscience can be annoying when it threatens to disrupt our carefully ordered lives. Perhaps that's why most people try not to listen too closely. This is the story of a man who heard that insistent voice and did what it told him. Some people call him crazy, others an inspiration.
Johnny was 9 years older than me, so I was much smaller. He was always, if you ask me, a little
charming. Once I met John, I was done. I was like, John.
He was unusual, but he was just part of the community.
John Francis in the rain. Look at that, celebrating the rain.
In those days, you could easily lose touch with people. And, I lost touch with John. He walked on.
I noticed him. John rose up to his full height, and he handed me this piece of paper that I have had for 34 years. It says, John gave up the use of motorized vehicles not long after an oil spill in San Francisco Bay in 1972. Since 1973, he has maintained a vow of silence.
When John moved to Point Reyes from Philadelphia, that was during the hippie era back then.
In the late 60s, this community was like a free zone for young people.
There was the hippie element, and there was the old-timers who had been there forever, but everybody sort of respected each other's differences. I don't think John stood out, but he was somebody that people talked about.
In those days, anywhere in America, you could be a part of this greater movement towards more of a freedom of expression, a freedom of life.
When I first saw John in town, he was sweeping the streets with a broom for some reason.
He went to walk outside. I said, yo, Johnny, you don't have no shoes on. I said, oh, that's all right. And I was like, okay.
This community, it was like a Star Wars bar. There was only one of a kind of everything.
Following a collision between the Arizona Standard and Oregon Standard, an oil spill.
The figure could go well beyond 1 million gallons.
It's just right under the Golden Gate Bridge and started spreading inland,
It was so upsetting to see our beautiful coastline in ruins like that.
It was the first time that I actually saw an environmental insult of that magnitude. The birds flapping in the water and the fish turning over and dying. And I could smell the oil.
We had this crisis. People were trying to figure out ways to heal the land, and John's way was to stop using oil-driven vehicles.
I decided to try and live a lifestyle more harmonious with the environment and to use less oil.
John's family back in Philadelphia didn't know what to think.
I first thought it was, yeah, he is crazy. I really didn't understand, what, you don't want to ride in cars. Well, everybody, like you say, marches to a different drum. He has to follow his own voice in his own head.
Love is but a song we sing. Feels the way we die.
Walking in the wild is a process of waking up. And the more you walk, the more you wake up.
You can make the mountains ring, or make the angels cry.
That natural gait, we're moving at the pace we were designed as primates to move.
He was partly motivated out of anger, trying to find a way, how do I process that? How do I show up differently in the world? That got him to that precipice where he took a leap.
Come on, people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now.
John's way to protest was to stop using oil-driven vehicles, and it made sense to me. John's decision to stop talking was a harder one for me to accept.
What was the purpose of not talking?
Not talking, that's an interesting question.
As a young adult, he found himself trying to be more than who he was just to get people to accept him. He wanted to be in the world differently.
What I saw in the media was that I could be a buffoon, or I could be a criminal, but could I be the person I am right now? And I didn't see that person.
Silence sort of put him into another frame of mind. He didn't have to prove himself anymore.
I used to have a chatter going on in my head all the time.
How you gonna stop driving in cars or walk?
Everybody's not going to do that, and I wasn't going to do that.
Me, that I was trying to figure out why he was doing what he was doing.
That's silly. Why?
And with no money, how's he going to survive?
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very well, thank you. How are you feeling, Dom? It was during that time of walking and not talking that I think I was rediscovering myself. I had no idea who I was going to be.
While I was on the job, they used to whisper and say, John got a nut.
My dad flew out to California, and he goes, okay, you can talk now. There's nobody here, it's just us. And I go, and he went. When I stopped speaking, I learned sign language for the deaf.
Thanksgiving, he was mimicking a turkey.
I said, oh, Shakespeare.
It's an interesting thing to be able to know somebody's personal sign language enough to understand nuance.
It didn't stop the communication. It was not an effort. It was kind of joyous.
So the best conversations I've ever had in my life have been with a guy who isn't saying anything.
To this day, I can't believe how many things I learned about him without him talking.
We need to communicate, all of us, about what's going on.
It seems like you communicate much more than a lot of people who talk, from the art and the writing. Did you know you had this in you, Jim?
A friend of mine, John Reed, he says to me, John, you know, you need something that when people see you, they go, oh, that's John Francis. He's the walker. He's walking now. I could see me smoking a cigar. And one day I was walking, smoke was coming out of my cigar. There was John Reed walking the other way, and
And I was so proud of myself walking down. And John got closer and closer, and we stopped, and he looked at me and he said, "John, that's the silliest thing I ever saw." Well, that was the end of my cigar, and I realized I had this banjo.
Yeah, look, State Street and 6th Avenue. I remember when they put that sign up. We had good childhood memories.
So we are the grandsons of immigrants. We would be the first generation.
My father's from Antigua. My mother, her parents were from the South, and they moved to Philadelphia.
I think with his father, when they said he wasn't talking, he thought that was just outrageous.
The impression I always had was my parents worrying about him. I would always be the conversation at our dinner table. Have you heard from him? Did you get a letter from him today? You're a black man in this era. He was taking a risk with his life.
I was in a different county on a kind of a mountain road. And driving up the road was a pickup truck. And I kind of got a funny feeling. So I just kept walking and I said, hey, boy, come here. There were two guys sitting inside the car. They looked really familiar in a way that I couldn't exactly put my finger on. And then one took a revolver and pointed it to my head. First he said, are you lost? And I went, and he said, we don't like your kind up around here. And he didn't say, your kind. I just said again. Looked at each other again, and he said, you just get. And finally I turned around. The truck was gone. I realized why they were familiar, because they were death. And I knew that death was familiar because without death, it wouldn't be life. I thought about just giving up. But I thought, death's gonna find you anyway. There's no running away, there's no walking away. And I wanted to live the way that I was living. And when death finds me, that's so be it.
Now John Francis has set out on what he calls a pilgrimage to promote environmental consciousness.
Personally, I thought it would last a few years or something. But as you see now, it's proved me wrong.
I'm not afraid of the black man running. He's got it right, he's got a better life coming.
When I started learning about outdoors and wilderness areas, I would just look at a map and, and look for the green spots.
Lost my sight and the state
My first trip across the Kalmiopsis was filled with rattlesnakes and hornets. And I met Perry and Ruth Davis, who had their little cabin. They were gold miners in a different ilk. They weren't about tearing the place up. They were more interested in just taking enough gold to allow them to live where they were living. I learned a lot about wilderness through them.
We learned how to chop down a tree and built an outhouse. I didn't have a lot of expectation other than just being able to walk to Oregon with John. But as I walked with him more and more, I found that my environmental awareness became more intact. So lots of pictures of trees that we used to, let's see here. Oh, there's John. I'm not very good at doing hands, but that was John playing.
Walking for me was like a pilgrimage. I learned some things on the road, but I always wanted to know more. On my way north, I decided I would go to school.
And I said, how in the hell is he going to go to school without talking? But he did.
I started my undergraduate at Southern Oregon State College.
I went into the school registrar's office and I was gonna, think. I got my degree in science and math and creative writing.
I think he came to my office. I don't think he was in a class of mine, but we said, let's put on a program. So it was multicultural, multimedia. Visually, it was very striking to have somebody on stage who was not speaking. So we even gave ourselves a name. We called ourselves The Path.
We just had fun.
John Francis may seem a bit like a performer left over from the 60s, a silent showman. But the interesting thing is that for an hour and a half, this 80s audience watched every move, followed every gesture, and listened.
By the time the 80s came along, boy, there was no cut and dried way to be in this country. But if you saw John on a college campus, he would look like a different kind of student,
I think my journey was misunderstood by some of the black students. They were wondering, as a black person, why was I putting myself through these contortions and what did that have to do with the struggle?
I thought it was a big waste myself. Because I could remember different things what we used to have to do in order to survive. Different advantages you could use. Talking, you have to talk.
You got to take a ride, you walked all the way out. You can't talk about civil rights in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, without talking about people walking. It's not standing still, it's not sitting down, it's something about the motion of people actually moving forward to advance justice.
We are here and we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
In 1964, when the Civil Rights Act came out, the other big piece of legislation that came out in the same year was the Wilderness Act. They do intersect. I like to think of John in conversation with this, wider environmental movement that's been around.
John Muir to Aldo Leopold, the environmentalists, the conservationists. Even though they were on the right path, they were on the white path. The environmental crisis, it is part of the equality of people, not just the equality of, one subset of people.
Without ever speaking, John managed to earn his college degree. He's often invited to lecture at colleges that cross his path.
I said, John, how did you teach without speaking? He orchestrated a conversation.
John just has an amazing smile, radiating joy. He had this saying that he would write on the board when he taught classes at the University in Madison. Live today what you believe. 5 words. Simple, right? Not simple, I don't think.
There's a kind of integrity about John that is uncommon. And just that alone really spills over.
When you start your graduate study in your PhD, it's very much, so what's your dissertation going to be? And it took me a year maybe of being in Madison. That's when I decided on oil spills, that I would write on oil spills. I never thought that I was going to actually get a PhD. I thought that I was going to take some classes and maybe learn some things, but did I have the stick-to-itiveness to actually write a dissertation? I decided that, yes, I can do this. In fact, I'm going to do this. And that's how I got to be Dr. Francis.
He got his PhD. Dr. Francis. That's pretty cool.
Why did you leave Wisconsin, and where'd you go?
I had to go home, and I was walking around the world, remember? And so I left Wisconsin and...
Must have wrote a letter to my mother and said he's gonna do something for Earth Day and, come on down.
National Geographic was there, and the Los Angeles Times sent someone. I played the banjo. And then I started to speak.
Thank you for being here.
I remember my mother gasping,
Oh my God! Johnny's talking again. Praise the Lord.
My mother said that my voice sounded like water over stones.
He was very careful with his words. I think he was getting used to his voice as a speaking person in the world after 17 years of not talking.
After walking across the country, after going to school, I wanted to remind myself that after all those years, I was going to speak for the environment. And the environment, for me, had changed to be really about how we treated one another. I never thought I would have a PhD or that I would be a goodwill ambassador. I guess I owe people something. Later, when I was in Vermont to see some friends who were from the University of Wisconsin, my dad calls me and says that somebody from the Coast Guard called, and they said, we want you to come to Washington and help write the oil pollution regulations. Oil spills. No one's interested in oil spills, and no one was until...
Exxon is mobilizing all available resources.
This is a major tragedy for the environment and for the people up there.
Exxon Valdez was in March of 1989. It became very clear that there was just too many gaps in the Clean Water Act to actually cover what the damage was to the environment.
Fortunately, I had started talking so I could answer the telephone. They said, we'll send you a plane ticket and you can fly down here. I said, actually, I don't fly in planes. I actually don't ride in trains either. Dr. Francis, you don't ride in cars either, do you? And all the little dollar bill signs fly away. And there's this long silence. Dr. Francis, we'll be waiting.
They didn't know when he was going to arrive because he was walking. They just kind of left an open office for him. And suddenly one day it was open. There he was. It's very easy to get lost on some of the technical and more esoteric aspects of oil spill response. And John kept sort of that public face on it. Having a black man who's walked across the US talking about environmental justice as part of this policy paints a pretty powerful picture in Washington, D.C. But he was forcing people in the Coast Guard to listen. You know, we're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that ratio. John used it in a ratio where it was 2 ears with no mouth for a long time.
It's a very powerful thing when you meet someone who has their own way of being in this world, their own way of looking and hearing and listening, and that's someone you want to pay attention to.
There was a time as I was walking in night, off in the distance, I see what looks like the lights of a big city. It's beautiful. And I started walking closer and I'm going, no. Those are stars. We're in the Milky Way. Wait a minute. They weren't stars at all, but they were fireflies. It took my breath away. I mean, it literally took my breath away, and I had to stop and just stare up at the stars and the lightning bugs and the cityscape all rolled into one.
Dr. Francis, let's get back to that stillness within when you discovered so much about yourself.
Lots of people asked, look, you walked across America. You didn't speak for 17 years. You didn't ride in cars for 22 years. You went to university, you walked and you listened. What did you learn? What, tell me. The environmental crisis is not just a crisis of pollution and climate change. It's also a crisis of mind and spirit.
I think one of the challenges we have in this country when we talk about nature, the environment, is this idea to talk about it as something outside of ourselves.
That is its own kind of psychosis, to think we are separate from the earth when we are not.
The environment is really all of us.
His mission changed from protest to human kindness.
I think kindness is the special sauce. You'll say, oh, John, come on, being kind, is that it? Is that what your message is? Yes, that's my message. Be kind to each other, because how we treat each other is our first opportunity for your kindness to manifest in the physical environment around us. I don't know if tomorrow's going to come, but I do know I have this moment right now. And so that's what I want to live, this moment with you right now. I'm just standing in front of you, and this is who I am.